I've decided there's no more playing it safe. So today I'm going to get out of my comfort zone and take some risks. Let's just hope it all pays off in the end. I've been really trying to push myself recently to get out of the norm. And that's not only with new techniques and joinery in the shop, but also with the design of the pieces I build. So this project is designed to push me in a way that I haven't been pushed in a while. I just hope that isn't a colossal mistake. As with all projects, the first thing I need to do is break down my materials. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's dive into the design so we can set some expectations. This piece is going to be a rather lengthy media console to replace my 1990s glass monstrosity. It was cool while it lasted. So this updated version is going to feature some caned doors to allow for good airflow to hidden consoles and receivers, while the center will be comprised of fluted drawer fronts, and the drawer boxes will feature variably spaced dovetails that will ride on push-to-open slides. Finally, the base is designed in a way that it will lift the piece from the ground, giving a somewhat floaty appearance. So now that we're all on the same page, let's get to work making this piece come to life. And the first step there is going to be milling down some of my rough cut pieces. At this point in the project, my focus is going to be working on the casework, and that includes the interior and exterior parts of my carcass. Now when it comes to milling down lumber, my ultimate goal here is to get my pieces as flat and straight as possible. That becomes a bit more challenging when it comes to the size of the boards that I'm working with here, as the overall length, or I guess width for this piece, is going to be 72 inches. So that means working with some pretty long boards. Now, when working with pieces that are that long, my goal is to get them as flat as possible, knowing that I probably won't get them all perfectly flat. There may be a slight bow in the boards from end to end, but we'll address that here in a minute. The main things you really want to watch out for are any cups, twists, or crooks. Those are issues in the lumber you want to address at the milling process, otherwise they're going to become a real problem down the line. Just like how my wife waits until I'm on the opposite side of the house to ask me, deciphering that might honestly be the hardest part of marriage. So with the milling all wrapped up, the next step in the process is to lay out the grain orientation for all of my panels. Whenever you're building panels, it's a good idea to make your best looking boards be the ones that are seen. So in this case, these boards I'm working on now are going on the top. But if your cabinet was hung on the wall, for example, then you'd want those front facing panels to be the best, or maybe even the bottom, depending on how high the cabinet's going. And once I've laid out my grain orientation, I'm going to go ahead and do the in-out method over at the joiner. And all that means is I'm going to face one face of my board in towards the joiner fence, and then flip the board so that the opposing face faces out. This way, when the two edges come together to form my glue joint, if there's any discrepancy in my joiner's setup, those angles will offset and the boards will come together perfectly. Now, in the past couple videos, I've been talking a whole lot about using a number 7 joiner plane to clean up my edges for panel glue ups. And even though I did the in-out method over at the joiner, I'm still going to finish those edges with the joiner plane just to clean them up even more. Now, in all honesty, this step's not completely necessary. I didn't start doing it until about 3 months ago, and my panels prior to that turned out just fine. But now that it's been a part of the process and it's been successful, I have a hard time not doing it. Plus, it gives me an excuse to whip out a big ass plane, and that's always fun. I believe that the fit and finish that you get from hand tools is just far more superior than what you get straight off the machine, which I've discussed at length, so I'm not going to hop back on that soapbox right now. There's just certain steps in the shop that give you a more quality finish, and for me, hand tools are the way to go, even if my back doesn't agree with that assessment later on that evening. So next it was time to plunge a few mortises into the edges of my boards that I marked out earlier. Whenever I'm working with 3/4 material or less, I like to use a domino to make sure that all my board faces align properly during the glue up. And this is especially important when it comes to making panels, since you don't want to have one board slip or slide when you apply clamping pressure. Now, I understand full well that a domino is a big expense and not everyone has the budget for one. So in most cases, like this one, you could use a biscuit joiner instead of a domino, which is a much more cost-effective tool. Both will work great for aligning board faces. And to take that even one step further, you could use dowels. They make plenty of jigs for that as well, so there's a lot of different ways that you can get these faces to align. Either way, when building hardwood projects, you'll plunge more holes than the Mario Brothers. So the next step in the process is to go ahead and get all these panels assembled. And rather than show you every panel coming together, I'm just going to highlight a few tips as I go through it. And the first tip's going to be that whenever you're using dominoes, biscuits, or dowels, go ahead and pop those in place first on one edge of all your boards. This way you don't have to worry about doing so when you're in the middle of your glue up. My next tip would be that when working with large panels when you're alone, feel free to squeeze the boards for your panel in place using the clamps. I can't tell you how many times I struggled with putting panels together before I realized this trick. If you glue one edge at a time, you can just apply a little clamping pressure to squeeze it in place, then release that clamping pressure and move on to the next edge. For me, it's taken a lot of stress out of large panel glue-ups and helps me not get so heated under the pressure. So now I can finally confirm to all those who signed my 7th grade yearbook that I did indeed stay cool. With the glue dry, I could go ahead and give all my boards a quick sanding. But when sanding this one, I did notice that after the glue up, there was a slight crack that appeared in the bottom of the board. Now, this crack or check was probably there before I did the glue up, I just overlooked it, so I'll just quickly address it now. In the last video, I used a butterfly key to address a check in the top of my desk. But here I'm going to take a different approach. I'm just going to rip the panel straight down the center of the crack, then rejoint those edges and glue everything back together. This is another reason to make sure that you're gluing up your panels slightly oversized. If I had glued these panels up exactly to my final dimension, I wouldn't have enough room to address this crack. But because I planned ahead and I left my panel about an inch or two wide, I have a little bit of a buffer in there to address the problem before it becomes bigger, which is exactly what will happen if you don't address cracks early. And speaking of addressing things early, if you're enjoying this video and you find the tips and tricks are useful, please drop it a like and subscribe. It really helps the video out and I greatly appreciate your support. So with all my other panels out of clamps, I could go ahead and use a glue scraper to remove any squeeze out and then give everything a quick sanding. Here I'm not looking for my panels to be perfectly smooth, but I do want to remove any of that squeeze out so that it doesn't alter or interfere with any of my joinery. So now that my panels are all cleaned up, I can go ahead and rip them down to their final width. And to do that, I'm just going to use my table saw. Now, at the risk of sounding like a parrot, I'll go ahead and repeat myself and just let you know that when I say final width, I mean it kind of loosely. And that's because I'm going to leave all my work pieces about a 32nd of an inch oversized. This way I can plane and sand back to that final dimension once everything's assembled. Now, because these pieces are so long, I don't have the luxury of being able to cut them at the table saw to their final length. So instead, I'll just use a track saw. And I'll accomplish that by hanging the piece off the edge of my workbench and clamping it down. When I'm cutting down pieces with a track saw, I like to reference the same edge for each cut. So here, for example, I'm referencing off the front-facing edge of the panel. And once I trim this flush, I'll rotate the workpiece and again reference off the front edge. This ensures that I have 3 square edges on my panel, and if there's anything off, it's only on one side. Luckily for me, that 4th side would be the rear, so if it was off a little, it wouldn't change things. From there, I'll follow that same process for the bottom panel of the case. Only this time after that initial cut, I'll reference both my workpieces together so that I can mark out the final length. This ensures that both the top and bottom panels of my case are exactly the same dimension. This also means that if I'm off by a hair with the top, then I'll be off by a hair on the bottom, so my pieces will match up perfectly. Next, it was time to cut my 2 sides down to their final length, and to do that, I'll just use my miter slit. Now my process here is exactly the same as it is with the track saw. The only difference here is that the sled's moving instead of the saw blade. So again, I'll just reference off one edge to make sure that I have 3 square edges, and then I'll go ahead and make the cuts. Now, I think it's important to point this out only because I feel like there's so many people that think there's only one way to do things in woodworking. And that's not necessarily the case. I could accomplish this same task with the track saw or with a straight edge and a circular saw. It really doesn't matter. What really matters at the end of the day is that the cuts are accurate and that my pieces line up. So no matter what tools you're working with or tools you have in your own shop, what's most important is trying to be as accurate as you can with the tools you have. Next, I could go ahead and lay out the joinery for the exterior of the case. Now, in this case, no pun intended, I'm going to be using domino joinery. And in actuality, it's been a few years since I've assembled a piece like this. One part I wanted to accentuate with this piece are the sides or end caps. So with that in mind, I'm going to offset the top and bottom by about 1/4 of an inch. This will really exaggerate the curve along the front edge and add a bit more visual interest. So once I've plunged the mortises into the end grain of the top and bottom pieces, I can rotate the fence 90 degrees and plunge the mortises into the sides. Now before I get a bunch of well actuallys down in the comments, I do understand that this is an end grain to face grain joint and that that's not always ideal. But when you're working with floating tenons, end grain to face grain joinery becomes a lot more doable. Now would I recommend assembling a case like this with no internal support? Probably not. But there's going to be a bunch of stop dado joinery supporting this piece internally, plus a rear panel which will do a lot to prevent racking. So in this particular case, I'm not worried about it. I mean, let's be real. 100 years ago, a couple brothers said they could fly, and they were right too. Next, it was time to turn my attention to those stopped dados. And to lay those out, I'm just going to use a combination of squares and rules. What I like to do when I'm laying out dado joinery is clamp my 2 workpieces together with the back edge at the center. This way I can just lay out the joinery on one panel and then extend it out to the other. And since my boards are butted up against each other from the back side, I can go ahead and cut those dados in one pass with my router. And in this orientation, the top panel is just going to flip onto the bottom panel when it comes time for assembly. So cutting them this way also ensures that they'll line up perfectly. With this setup, I don't have to worry about one dado being slightly off from the other, because if one's off, then both are off, so it makes things a little bit easier. I think the biggest thing to watch out for when you're cutting stopped dados is just making sure that you stop when you need to stop and that your depth of cut is set correctly. From there, all you have to do is plunge and move with a consistent feed rate. For me, I think the more challenging part is cutting your shoulder panels to the correct length. Because at this point, if you cut the boards too short, there's really no going back without having to make new panels. If you cut them long, you can kind of save it, but in my experience, it's still best to try to nail that measurement directly off the table saw. Another way you can work around that is just to cut out a scrap piece out of 1/2-inch plywood and check the fit. I'm about half and half about when I do that versus when I don't. It really just depends on how lucky I'm feeling in the shop that day. But I'd love to know how you guys fit internal parts. Are you a one and done type of person, or do you do some testing? If you live on the edge and just use your actual workpiece to check the fit, start your comment with one and done. But if you do some testing beforehand, start your comment with testing. And as always, if you start your comment with testing or one and done, I'll reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. And yes, I really do try to reply to every single comment. So right off the table saw, the shoulders on all my panels are a little bit snug, and that's actually by design, because what I'm going to do is finesse those fits using a shoulder plane. And in case you're not aware of what a shoulder plane is, it's a hand plane with a blade that runs the width of the plane's body, which allows for the plane to get right up against the edge of the shoulder to thin out the cheeks. Now there's a bit more technicality involved with the tool, but that's the gist of it. And after a few passes, those vertical partitions fit like a glove. Next, I could cut in the stop dado joinery for my shelves, and I'll lay those out exactly like I did the tops and bottoms, and in fact cut them the same way too. Although with smaller workpieces, it does get a little tricky on figuring out how to clamp them together, especially when using a guide rail and router assembly. Those things just take up a lot of real estate. So with the dados cut into my vertical partitions, I could go ahead and pop them back in place and check the fit for my shelves. And I actually did things a bit out of order here in that I cut the shoulders for my shelves before I cut the dados. Luckily for me, it worked out in this situation, but I wouldn't recommend making a habit of doing so. So now that I've got those parts in place, I just want to thank Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring today's video. Woodworkers Guild of America is an awesome online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information for woodworkers of any skill set. And believe it or not, I need tips from time to time too. And I've been able to use their database of tutorials to help me work through shop problems when they come up. For instance, one of the more interesting things I've wanted to tackle is making my own wood finishes. And George Von Driska has a quick video on how to get started making your own. They have more premier instructional videos taught by friendly experts like making jigs and fixtures, bandsaw techniques, cabinet making videos, and so much more. But to fully appreciate the extensive content they offer, you just have to check it out for yourself. Trust me, there's a ton of great info in their ever-expanding catalog, not to mention accessing their exclusive content will cost you next to nothing. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49. So take advantage of this great deal and step up your craftsmanship by joining Woodworkers Guild of America today. So next it was time to cut the stops into the shoulders for those stopped dados. And I just like to do that over at the bandsaw. The biggest thing here is to try to undercut that shoulder. Because if you go too far, the front edge of all your internal parts are going to have a gap, and that's not going to be very appealing. Instead, I'll leave a little bit of material on the shoulder and then clean that up using a chisel. Now, when it comes to removing the waste for those cuts, I find it easiest just to use a pole saw. This way I don't risk cutting too deep over at the bandsaw. Then from there I can just bust out the chisels and shave off any remaining material. Again here I'm just careful not to overcut any of those parts and leave any unsightly gaps. It's also a good idea to use a chisel that's quite a bit wider than your stock in this situation, because the larger blade gives you more control and allows you to take it at one pass, as long as it's pretty sharp, so no paint can openers. And with all the notches complete, I could go ahead and pop them back in place and check their fit. And yeah, I think that'll work just fine. So with my internal parts fitting nicely, I could go ahead and cut rabbets into the top and bottom panels. At this point, I'm going to hold off on cutting the rabbets onto the backs of the sides. This way I can just route those once the entire case is assembled. And I'll do that because if I wait, I don't have to worry about the stops at the top and bottom. From there, it's on to sanding and edge treatments. Now, I've discussed this before, but it's 10 times easier to sand all your internal parts prior to doing your glue ups. And that's because if you clean up all your internal parts beforehand, you don't have to worry about reaching into those tight spaces. Of course, there's going to be some glue squeeze out that inevitably gets on these, but at least for now, they're pretty clean. Which is more than I can say about my son's room 5 minutes after it's been cleaned. Now for my smaller panels, I just clean up those edges using a hand plane. But for the larger top and bottom panels, I find that it's a lot easier to use an edge sander. And that's because positioning large panels can get kinda wonky. And with the 90-degree attachment on the sander, it makes sanding those edges really effortless. The last step for the top and bottom panels is to cut an edge detail using a roundover bit on the outside facing edges. And I'll smooth those transitions just using a sanding block. From there, it's onto the edge detail for the fronts of the sides. And to do that, I'm just going to use some double stick tape to hold my two workpieces together and then mark out a symmetrical curve using a drawing bow. Once everything's marked out, I can head over to the bandsaw to trim out the curve. And here, I'm just trying to get as close to my line as possible, obviously without going over. If I was going to do more than 2 or 3 of these, I'd probably make a template for the process, but given that these are one-off parts, using a drawing bow and then freehanding them will work out just fine. Again, to clean up any of the saw marks and sand back to my line, I'll just use the edge sander. If you're like me, then you're probably a little nervous to get started freehanding things in the shop. And using a template is a great safety net, so if that's something you like to do, then I'd say stick with it. But as you gain more confidence in the shop, you're going to be able to start freehanding parts, and it's not going to be as big of a deal. I'd say on the other hand, if you make a mistake on a part like this and it's a one-off, then you have to learn to fix it, and it forces you to adapt in the shop, which is a good skill to have. So while I might not recommend cutting a big contour on a massive tabletop, if you have a smaller part that you can freehand, I'd say give it a go. And to those of you who just freehand everything anyway, you're a madman, and I love it. So next, it was on to the glue up. And I'm going to do this in 2 separate glue ups because I didn't like the way I had to position the clamps for the center partitions if I had to do this in one glue up. So instead, I decided to focus on the exterior carcass with the first glue up, and there I just slid in my interior parts to kind of hold everything in place. And then the next morning I came back in the shop and glued in the interior parts. So with everything looking flat and square, I was on to the drawer boxes. And the milling process for the drawer box material, which is white oak, is going to go exactly like it did for the casework. The only difference is instead of 3/4 of an inch thick, this material is going to be 5/8 of an inch thick so that I have plenty of room to cut in my dovetails. So with my drawer box material milled down, I could turn my focus to the drawer slides. Now, the drawer slides I'm using here are Movento by Bloom, and this is my first time using this particular type of slide, and in fact I'm installing them incorrectly here, and that they need to be inset slightly from the front, but I'll fix that later on. Really the coolest thing about these drawer slides is that they have this thing called a tip-on feature, which allows you to have push-to-open drawer slides plus soft-close motion. So it's kind of a double whammy. There's some extra hardware involved, like this linkage bar that attaches both slides together so that they slide in unison. But honestly, attaching all the extra parts isn't all that complicated. Again, the inset was a misunderstanding on my part, so I can't really blame Bloom for that one. It's just like when I'm singing along to a song and the artist gets the words wrong. It's annoying, but it happens. Next, I needed to cut down all my material to its final length. Because I'm going to be using a pants router to cut my dovetails, I need to make sure that all my material is to its final length now before I start that process. And thankfully, the Bloom Movento drawer slides utilize the same style drawer box as the Bloom Tandem drawer slides. So I've got a ton of experience with those. So here I'm making sure that my material is about a 32nd of an inch longer than the internal dimension I took off my drawer slides. And the reason I'm going with a 32nd of an inch longer is because I want my dovetailed parts to be slightly proud. This way I can go back and hand plane and sand them flush once everything's assembled. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's get the panther router dialed in. Now, if you watched the channel before, you probably have seen me use this tool plenty of times. And the reason I like using it for dovetails is because it gives me a lot of control and it allows me to repeat those cuts. So once I've set up my templates and dialed everything in, which takes about 45 minutes or so, I can go ahead and just dive into cutting my tails and pins. Another cool feature is that it allows me to cut variably spaced dovetails, which means I don't have to keep my pins and tails evenly spaced like I would off of a traditional router jig. Ultimately, this means I just have more control over what that final joint is going to look like. And it's really nice when you're creating custom pieces to make some of the joinery look more custom. I will say that there's a bit of a learning curve when using the tool, and that you have to start thinking about things from a more precise perspective. If you make a mistake in your configuration or your setup, the machine's not going to be very forgiving. And I'd say it's definitely a tool that requires you to be more detail oriented. And I only say that because I don't want people thinking that once you set up the machine, it does all the work for you. It does take time to learn, and honestly, I'm still learning something new about it just about every time I use it. But with all that being said, this is a machine that I couldn't live without at this point. And Pencil Router reached out to me recently to offer me a discount code I could give to you guys. So if you're interested in getting your own Pencil Router, check out the coupon code in the description. And I'll also add that there's no feeling quite like being able to cut a nice tight joint and being able to repeat it whenever you need to. So with the pins and tails fitting perfectly on my first test pieces, I could go ahead and repeat that same process for the remaining small drawer parts. Now don't get me wrong, I'd love to cut all these drawer parts by hand, but that process would honestly take me like 2 or 3 days, which unfortunately at this point in my career just isn't a viable option. And when using a Pencil Router, I can knock out all these dovetails in just a few hours, which is why I lean towards using it pretty frequently. So once I wrapped up the pins and tails on the smaller drawer boxes, I could move on to the larger ones. And again here, all I have to do is reconfigure my templates and then follow the same procedure as I did for the smaller boxes. I think the only downside to using a router to cut dovetails is that occasionally there's tear out that I just can't plan for. But I think that inherent risk exists every time you use a router. So I feel like it's safe to say that if you're okay with using a router in other situations, then you should be fine using one for dovetails. Again, like I suggested earlier, there's about 20 ways to accomplish the same tasks in the shop. It's just doing what you feel is most comfortable and gives you the best results. Next, it was time to cut the groove for my drawer bottoms. And to cut those, I'll install a flat tooth blade over at the table saw and cut in that groove in 2 passes. If I try to cut this groove in with a 1/4 inch dado stack, it's going to end up being too loose. So I like using an 1/8 inch blade and taking 2 passes until I get to my desired fit. From there, I'll head over to the bandsaw and use it to cut a notch on the rear panel. This will clear space for the drawer slides and allow the drawer slide pins to lock into the drawer boxes. And speaking of pins, you probably noticed that I'm cutting off my pins here. And for now, I'll just hold on to these and label them appropriately so I know where they go back. Don't worry, that will make more sense here in a minute. Some call it multitasking, I call it doing something else until I remember what I was doing in the first place. From there, it's on to cutting down my 1/4 inch white oak ply for the drawer bottoms. Yeah, it's showing a lot of warping, but don't worry, it'll flatten out as I go. So while I get to the bottom of things there, let me just say that I design, build, and edit the projects you see in these videos on nights and weekends. And the support I receive from you guys means the world to me. So if you enjoy the show and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes, access to monthly plans, a Discord invite where we chat about tips and tricks pretty much all day every day, and a lot more exclusive access that you just can't get with YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link in the description. And as always, if you can't join today, no sweat. Thanks for watching, liking, and sharing. And a massive thank you to those of you who've already joined. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. Alright, let's go on with the chlorophyll. The next step in the process was to glue up the drawer boxes. And since these are dovetailed boxes, they come together pretty straightforward. Really, my only tip when working with dovetail joinery is to use a minimal amount of glue. If you oversaturate the joint, you could cause splitting or cracking when you do apply clamping pressure, so remember this isn't a lamination and go easy on the yellow stuff. And when it comes to clamping up a dovetailed drawer box, I feel like too many's never enough. It's a good idea to have a clamp on the top and bottom of the joint on all 4 sides. This way you ensure even clamping pressure across the entire joint. After about an hour and a half in clamps, I pop the drawer boxes out and clean up the joints using a hand plane. If there were any hairline gaps in the joints from tear out, now would be the opportunity to squeeze a little bit of wood glue in there and then sand immediately after. That will fill in those hairline gaps and make them pretty much non-existent. From there, I'll flip the drawer box upright and even up the top edges with a hand plane. And that's why earlier I left all these drawer boxes slightly oversized, because once the glue up's complete, there's a slight chance that these have offset by a hair, and using a hand plane gives me the opportunity to even all that out. With everything evened up, I can head over to the bandsaw and trim off the waist side of the pin that I kept from earlier. From there, a little CA glue and a sanding block will help me conceal that rear pin, and no one will be the wiser. And with the drawer boxes all completely assembled and sanded down, I can go ahead and move on to installing the drawer hardware. And I have a couple jigs that usually make this process super easy, but again, these are slightly different drawer slides, so I'm only able to use parts of them. The good thing is I can just reference off the angles for the parts that I am able to use and make it happen. Once I had the drawer box hardware installed, I went ahead and inset the drawer slides to their correct depth and popped the drawer boxes in place. Yep, things are really starting to come together. In part 2 of this build, I'll create the fluted drawer fronts, caned cabinet doors, and the floating base. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. But until then, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.